This is our lesson for Sunday, March the 12th of 2023, and this is part of our Bible Studies for Life that comes from Lifeway, that series, and the series is entitled, My Encounter with Jesus. We're looking at passages from the Gospel of John that will take us all the way to and through Jesus' resurrection on Easter Sunday morning, which is April the 9th. So a very, very special time, I think. A very great way of letting these lessons lead up to that resurrection story. We're looking today at John chapter 5, specifically verses 2 through 11 and then 19 through 21. Again, a pretty familiar story that we have here. So let's take a look at this passage. And again, you'll probably remember this. Most scholars think this probably takes place on the second time Jesus had come to Jerusalem for one of the festivals, and they're thinking this might have been a fall festival that Jesus came to. But he is there, and of course he's going to go into the temple as well and teach there. And so we kind of start this narrative off with, by the sheep gate in Jerusalem, there is a pool called Bethesda in Aramaic, which has 5 colonnades. A lot just in this verse, just to kind of for us to keep in mind. Most scholars think that the sheep gate was probably in the northern wall of the temple, and that this may well have been a pool where, when the sheep were brought in to be sacrificed, they were washed first in this pool. So that may well have been the case, and so this also becomes a place, as we find out in verse 3, where there are others too. The pool is called Bethesda, basically meaning house of mercy in Aramaic. It has 5 colonnades. Many people think they were probably built by Herod the Great, and as we move into verse 3, which says, within these lay a large number of the disabled, blind, lame, and paralyzed. We look at this little part of the passage, and we say this would probably be because of those colonnades that would have provided some shade for these individuals, a good place for them to be, because they would not necessarily be out in the hot sun all day long. They could be here, excuse me, and ask for alms. Got something in the throat there. And maybe people, as they came through, might give them alms as well. Because this was an area that was frequented by these disabled individuals, maybe some of them who just kind of stayed there day and night, this would have been a place that wealthy and very religious Jews would have avoided like the plague, because these people would have been unclean. But Jesus doesn't avoid this place, does he? Jesus didn't avoid Samaria, and he doesn't avoid this place either. These are places where the need is. Well, then we move on to the next verse to look at. And notice we move from verse 3 to verse 5. We skip over verse 4 and actually the latter part of verse 3 as well. In our teacher's book, we discover that this is something that the oldest manuscripts for the last half of verse 3 and all of verse 4 just don't have in there. This is the little part of the verse that explains the fact that there was a legend that an angel would sometimes come down and stir the waters of this pool, and the first one to get in would be healed. Now, good Jews would not have liked this story at all. They would not have believed this story at all, because this is much more magic than it is faith. And so they would not have wanted this story told. So it's only in later manuscripts that we find the second half of verse 3 and all of verse 4. So a lot of translations now will have that as a footnote at the bottom of the page with the translation. Because again, we're always trying to find whatever is closest to the original text that in this case John would have written. But it does kind of give us some background as to why so many people were here. And that pops up in the latter part of the next part of these verses. Jesus says that John tells us there was one man there who had been disabled for 38 years. You know, most people in the New Testament would not live much past 40 or 42. So this man had pretty much been paralyzed, lame, for all of his life. He probably had never known the ability or could not remember a time when he was able to stand up and walk. When Jesus saw him lying there and realized he had already been there for a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to get well?" No, this is such an interesting question because I think we would say, well, of course he wants to get well. That's why he's here. No, he believes in this story of sometimes an angel comes and stirs the water and the first person to get in gets healed. And we need to keep in mind, too, a story like that does not survive unless sometimes people get into the water and they do get healed. I mean, if it's a story that never seems to work, sometimes the things get moving around in the water. Again, some scholars think it's because maybe there was a spring that kind of fed that, and sometimes the spring would kind of move around the water. I mean, if you have that legend, but it never works, and goes for 10, 20, 30 years, you don't have that legend anymore. People aren't going to believe that because it never happened. So occasionally it must have happened. And maybe this was a psychological healing that took place, but people believed they were healed and they left. And so, do you want to get healed? Do you think that after 38 years, with the condition that you've been going, that there's any possibility that you can get healed? That's the real question here. You've been going through this pretty much all of your life. Do you even remotely believe now that there's a chance that you can get healed? "Well, sir," the disabled man answered, "I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up." And I think that's probably why that was added to the second half of verse 3 and verse 4 as well. This idea of, okay, well, let's explain why somebody would want to get into this pool when the water was stirred up. "But while I'm coming," and of course, is he able to move himself just with his arms and drag himself over that? No, even if he was kind of sitting right beside the pool, to get himself into the pool, even to fall in, others could certainly be in there before he was. "But while I'm coming," and it's going to take a process, "someone goes down ahead of me, so he never can be the first." And maybe he has seen people healed, and so he knows, well, yes, maybe that's going to be the possibility for me too, but I just can't get there in time. Now, notice with this too, that the only way he thinks he can be healed is for him to get in this water once it's been stirred and to be the first one to get in. For him, that is the only way that he can be healed. "Get up," Jesus told him. "Pick up your mat and walk." Well, now there's another way that he can be healed, isn't there? No, Jesus instructs him, you don't have to wait for the water. Get up now and pick up your mat, probably just a little mat of straw, and then roll it on up and walk. Instantly, the man got well. Instantly, he felt strength returning to his legs, maybe to his arms as well. And he stood up, picked up his mat, and started to walk. It's just instantaneous. What I wonder sometimes about this is, suddenly others were certainly around him. Does Jesus heal them too? Perhaps he did. We don't have that in the narrative because it focuses so much on this one healing. But certainly here's a person who can heal us. We don't have to wait for the water to be stirred. But we kind of hope that maybe Jesus stays around and does some other healing too. But now here comes the real kicker. Now that day was the Sabbath. And we know from pretty much all the Gospels that Jesus is constantly getting in trouble for healing people on the Sabbath, because that is looked at as doing work on the Sabbath day. And in fact, the man, when he is caught by the Jews, as we'll find out, he is accused of doing work too on the Sabbath. And so the Jews said to the man, they probably see him walking past, and he'd been healed. So they said, "This is the Sabbath. The law prohibits you from picking up your mat." And again, we are aware of the fact that one of the Ten Commandments is to remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. It's a day of rest. It's a day of worship. It's a day for us to refrain from what we normally do and, in fact, be given the opportunity to rest ourselves physically, but also to rest ourselves spiritually and be refreshed. But certainly by the time of Jesus, there had been all kinds of rules added as to things that could be done on the Sabbath and things that could not be done on the Sabbath. You could not cook on the Sabbath day, but you could hire the day before a Gentile to come in and cook for you on the Sabbath day. You couldn't light a fire on the Sabbath day in order to keep yourself warm or to cook, but of course you could hire a Gentile the day before to come in on the Sabbath and do that for you, again, if you were wealthy enough, and not many people would have been wealthy enough to do that. You couldn't make bread because kneading the bread, that was considered work as well. You know, we sometimes read those stories in the Gospels where Jesus spits in the mud and mixes that all together and puts it on the blind person's eyes and then tells him to go and wash. And when he does, he's able to see again. Well, Jesus does that on the Sabbath too. And he's accused of working on the Sabbath because making that mixture of spittle and mud, the dirt that is there, is like kneading. And so he's breaking that commandment. He's working on the Sabbath day. So one of the strange laws, too, was that if there was someone lying on a bed who needed to be moved, you could move him and move the bed on the Sabbath day. But you couldn't just pick up a bed with nobody in it, or a straw mat with anybody in it. That would be working on the Sabbath day. And so this man replied, "The man who made me well told me, pick up your mat and walk." No, this is certainly someone, he's healed without any faith whatsoever, is he? No, we sometimes will say, well, okay, and certainly faith healers will say this in our day and time, and have always said this. Oh, you've got to have faith, and so if you weren't healed, you didn't have enough faith. Well, this man has no faith at all, does he? For him, the only way he could possibly be healed was for him to get into that water as the first one when the water is all stirred up. No, he doesn't see any other way possible to be healed. But Jesus heals him anyway, despite his lack of faith. And now the man is in trouble with the Jews, and so he now blames it on Jesus. Well, no, you're the one. This other guy made me well, but he doesn't even know his name, does he? You would kind of hope that if someone healed you, you might thank them and you might ask what their name was, that you would just be so grateful. But apparently he's not done that. Jesus tells him to get up, and he gets up, rolls up his mat, and walks on out. And then here in the meantime, Jesus will encounter this man back in the temple. And people wonder, well, did Jesus just bump into him, or was Jesus on the lookout for him too, because there was more this man needed to know? Jesus tells him, make sure that you don't sin anymore. It was very common to blame illnesses on sin. And Jesus doesn't always do that. But Jesus is aware, too, as we are, that to live in the wrong way can bring consequences, which can be health consequences, too. So then the man is able to tell the Jews who this was who healed him. It was this man, Jesus. And so now the Jews go and begin to question Jesus about this. And as they are questioning Jesus, they ask him this. What right do you have to break the Sabbath here and tell this person to break the Sabbath? Jesus replied, truly I tell you, the Son is not able to do anything on his own, but only what he sees the Father doing. For whatever the Father does, the Son likewise does these things. No, it was quite obvious to the Jews, as it is quite obvious to us as well. God doesn't take the Sabbath off and do nothing. He continues to govern the universe. He continues to work in his creation. He continues to sustain it so that it continues to go. Well, what Jesus is saying is, basically, I can't do anything on my own, but only what I see the Father doing. And if the Father is working to sustain his creation, I'm working too to sustain my creation as the Father's Son. And here's the Father up here. He's the one that we all look to. Jesus is subordinating himself to the Father, but he is also at the same time saying, but I can do what I see the Father doing. He has the power to do that. And for whatever the Father does, the Son likewise does those things too. So Jesus has that authority and power as well. Subordinate to the Father, but able to do whatever the Father does. And if the Father is working on the Sabbath day to care for his universe, to sustain his universe, then the Son can do that as well. For the Father loves the Son and shows him everything he is doing, and he will show him greater works than these, so that you will be amazed. And just as the Father raises the dead and gives them life, so the Son also gives life to whom he wants. The Jews believed that the Messiah would not be able to raise the dead. Only God could raise the dead. But Jesus says, just as the Father raises the dead and gives them life, so the Son also gives life to whom he wants. And that will include raising the dead. And it includes restoring life to this man who was paralyzed. At that point in time, there was not much hope, not much life available for someone who was disabled. There's so much more that a person can do in our day and time, and so much more that we help them be able to do in our day and time, because we value them as people. These kind of folks who were disabled in Jesus' time were just kind of tossed off to the side. So when Jesus gives him the ability to walk, he gives him the ability to work and to enjoy life. He restores his life. Jesus restored our life too, didn't he? And maybe he has healed us from disease, working with the power of the Spirit and the power of doctors and nurses. But he certainly has given us life, life abundant and eternal. He has given us life in this life and in the life to come as well. Let's join together in prayer. Father, Jesus, when he was on earth, was doing what he had seen you do. And you empowered him to do what you were able to do as well. He was there with you at creation and created with you. And he was there before he came on earth each Sabbath day to sustain this creation and to give life where life was needed. Father, he has given life to us as well, and we are so grateful for that. Father, thank you for Jesus. Thank you for the fact that God restored our life, just as he restored the life of this disabled man. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.